Hello, and thank you for tuning into our campaign's second Zebinar. I'm very excited to have you. Whatever you're watching this on, whether it's like Instagram, my website, YouTube, please like and subscribe. Sorry, that's cringy. I'm never gonna say that again. If this is your first Zebinar, thank you for tuning in again. And just to give you a brief primer on it, what I want these Zebinars to be uh, is an opportunity for civil discourse. So at the moment before the filing deadline, I'm just going to pre-record them, upload them, basically make a portfolio that people have something to access. But once the campaign really gets into high gear, I'm going to start hosting these lives. So the format is going to be issue of the week, the issue that we're highlighting. I'll then have a quick panel discussion, and then we'll open that forum up for people to ask questions, engage in discussion. Because I really want this to be voter education. When people cast their ballots, I want them to actually know the issues that are going on, feel educated about it. And I also want to give my opinions on the matter. And I want to show my commitment to the cause because often politicians get away with giving easy sound bites and they don't actually go into depth with voters about their opinions on matters, the implications of policy, and the why of it all. So I really just want to focus on that. So getting into the issue this week, we're going to do public education. As you can see, per usual, 3 parts: the flashback, currently, and the future worth fighting for. So for our flashback, we're just going to go through the history of public education. Also want to highlight the 2021 election in Virginia, just because many people say it was decided on public education, but I don't think that's the case. So I'll get into that. And then currently, just going through it right now, the assaults on education, CRT, critical race theory, because that is such a big thing at the moment. And then future worth fighting for, brief district profile. I mean, I couldn't find information on every single city in our district to make it a nice comprehensive one. So just going to be a quick run through. Pandemic policy, federal standards. It'll pretty much be it for public education, but I'm very excited for this. So let's jump in. So these pictures I have here are important because when the country first started, child labor was a thing. When people weren't living past the age of 30, you started working when you were 13. The Supreme Court has been integral in the development of public education in this country. That's why I have a picture of SCOTUS there. And I have 10 for the 10th Amendment, because in the U.S. Constitution, the federal government only gets to exercise powers that the Constitution explicitly gives it. 10th Amendment reserves all of those unsaid powers for the states. Education falls under the 10th Amendment, so education is actually governed individually by each state. But a quick walkthrough of the origin and purpose of public education, and really education in general. We have to remember that education for most of human history was a luxury. It was something that was reserved for the elite, the well-connected, the aristocracy, royalty. Those are pretty much everyone that was being educated. Common people couldn't read. That was a huge thing that the spread of Christianity, for instance, and the power of the church in early Europe, in medieval Europe, was pretty much handed down by priests. It was what they said it was because everyday people couldn't read the Bible. For just a quick fun fact, the Gutenberg press, when they were actually able to press out manuscripts instead of handwriting everything, literacy rates started to increase. But I've already went through that. 10th Amendment, how it reserves the power of education and governance over education for the states. And we have to remember that when education started to become mass education or public education, it was largely done by religious organizations. It was a common good. Different organizations would come through cities. They would have traveling schools where they would go around and educate children just as much as they could, because there was no system of education in the early days of the Republic. So the late 1700s, early 1800s. But when the Industrial Revolution came around, things began to change slightly. Again, child labor was rampant in the 1800s. People really weren't getting an education past the age of 10. And then those that were well connected. They were middle class, well off. When the Civil War came, that kind of puts a stopgap on everything that's there, because we're fighting in a war. People aren't trying to educate anyone. They're literally trying to save the existence of the United States as it was then. Um, like I said, child labor was rampant, so children education wasn't given a priority. And a huge thing was Plessy v. Ferguson. Once they got that separate but equal, Southern states were able to implement Jim Crow. And I'm going to get more into that on the next slide. But once the progressive era came around, once we started making those institutional changes in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and put a focus on education, that began to change. We began to see the modern mass education system emerge. So it's important when we think about the development of public education in this country to take note of segregation. Brown v. Board, that said to the states, hey, separate but equal is not a thing. Separate is actually inherently unequal. And that was decided in 1954. But Brown 2, a lesser known case, came around and the Supreme Court basically said to state, well, Southern states came to the Supreme Court arguing that desegregating would be such a huge, momentous task that they needed extra time. And the Supreme Court granted them that extra time. And what they did with it, obviously being the racists that they were, was pretty much just throw desegregation on the back burner. They stopped really caring for it. And in this period, you start to see white flight. When you see the Little Rock Nine and you see the National Guard having to go to the school to make sure that nothing dangerous would happen, to make sure that no one was killed in Arkansas, white people were leaving public school systems. They were putting their kids in private school systems. You start to see the emergence of redlining and all of these things that created two separate school systems. So for white kids that have been in this country for decades, centuries, they've had access to public education since it really came about in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But Black students still to this day don't have access to the same type of education that white students have because of this history, because of this racial history. And this connects to critical race theory, which we'll get into later. But you have to understand this history before you can go forward and try to actually develop policy that gives you educated and impassioned students. So major legislation for public education in this country, again, 10th Amendment, it's largely left to the states. But with the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the due process, the federal government got the power to make sure that people and citizens, both Black and white, were able to enjoy their rights, that the states could not enjoin them. So once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 comes around, the federal government is finally saying to the states on many different fronts that you need to stop this racism, just to say it simply. You need to stop racism. You need to stop educating two different classes of people. You need to integrate. You need to do all of these things that you would expect from a society that claims to be Christian. Excuse me. And then you see the development of the Department of Education in 1979. That's its modern form. The Department of Education has existed in various forms since the mid-1800s, but the modern Department of Education was developed in 1979. It started to implement those federal standards and make sure that schools were developing children that were ready to enter the workforce, because that's what education was designed to do, was create workers. You also see two landmark education legislation there, No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act. The No Child Left Behind Act was signed under George Bush, the second one. And that was when we really saw a major takeoff in standardized testing, where it was test. Let's make sure these students reach benchmarks. And in attempting to not leave any child behind, many children were just pushed through because it was the best thing that you could do. Why sit back and keep educating a person in second grade when the resources and the necessary faculty and staff aren't there to actually make sure that these children are getting the decent education they deserve? But that attempted to be changed with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which places a lesser importance on standardized tests and a more localized method of education. And there were many other legislations that went into developing our public education system as it exists today, but those are the main sticking points I want to focus on. But before we get any further, I want to go through the 2021 election because mainstream media, Washington Beltway press, and many people in Virginia have made this election about public education and what happened in Northern Virginia and the switching of suburban white women from Biden to Glenn Youngkin. So in this 2021 election, we have Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, against Glenn Youngkin, the Republican. Glenn Youngkin wins by about 63,000 votes, 64,000 if you want to round up. And again, public education with critical race theory, some sexual assaults that happened in Loudoun County, as well as McAuliffe's gaffe saying that parents shouldn't have a right in their, or shouldn't have a say in their children's education, all made this, it bubbled it, and it took over and made it this thing that's larger than what it actually was. And Republicans have looked at this and said, this is our 2022 playbook. This is what we can do if we won in Virginia, a state that was 10 points for Biden, and we can replicate this everywhere else, we'll win in 2022. And they're flat out wrong. And Democrats have accepted this narrative, and it's a mess. It's an honest mess. The reason Glenn Youngkin won was low turnout. And it was low turnout in specific parts of Virginia, not everywhere. Because when you look at this map, this is the percent change from 2017 when Ralph Northam was elected to the 2021 election. So this doesn't include any data about 2020. But if you don't know anything about Virginia, and for all of the people in this district watching this, you can see straight away what this map shows. Dark purple, high turnout in comparison to 2017. Lighter purple and that beige, abysmal turnout compared to 2017. Now, what this is that dark portion in west, the western part of Virginia, that's rural Virginia, Republican stronghold. Comparison to 2017, these people turned out. It was Trump voters that showed back up for Glenn Youngkin. And then when you look at the Democratic strongholds, you see a large drop in turnout, or the same turnout in comparison to 2017. Lynchburg, Roanoke City, Charlottesville, Portsmouth, Richmond City, Petersburg, Hampton, Norfolk, Newport News, literally District 3, Arlington, Alexandria. All of these places have just the same turnout that was in 2017. Yet Glenn Youngkin was able to boost turnout everywhere else. Now, looking at these numbers, we see that had Terry McAuliffe turned out voters at the same rate as Glenn Youngkin, he would have won. Look here in Hampton. Biden voters that turned out for Terry McAuliffe, 65%. Trump voters that turned out for Youngkin, 80%. In Hampton, had McAuliffe replicated Youngkin's turnout, he would have had 7,000 votes. In Newport News, if he replicated Youngkin's turnout, he'd have had 10,000. Norfolk, 11,000. Portsmouth, 5,000 more votes. Chesapeake, 12,000 more votes. So in District 3 alone, had Terry McAuliffe turned out voters at the same rate, not better than, but just at the same rate that Youngkin turned out 2020 voters, Terry McAuliffe would have had 45,000 more votes. He would have only been 20,000 votes shy from winning the election. Now look, District 3 is kind of right there in the middle, and these shapes are basically adjusted for population. So once you account for District 3, and then you include Richmond City, Petersburg, Charlottesville, Lynchburg, Arlington, Alexandria, you realize the issue was not education. The issue was simply Terry McAuliffe was not a good candidate. Specifically, these Democratic strongholds are concentrations of Black voters in Virginia. Black voters, the base of the Democratic Party, did not show up for Terry McAuliffe. But for Terry McAuliffe's failure to turn out Black voters, Glenn Youngkin won. That's it. It's that simple. And given that the Democratic primary for governor in 2021 was the most diverse in Virginia's history, and that we could have elected our first Black woman governor, that's why people weren't excited. You gave us Terry McAuliffe, and we could have had the first Black governor of the former seat of the Confederacy, people called BS, and rightfully so. It just is what it is. So it wasn't a question of education in 2021 as to why Glenn Youngkin won. It was a Democrat who did not turn out black voters, the base of the Democratic Party. And if we continue to do what we did here in Virginia in 2021, Republicans will win. But if we take stock of this, if we look at this data and actually digest it, it won't be an issue. It won't be an issue at all. But when do our parties ever actually look at the data and do what's right? They don't know. I even saw reports of them bringing in outside people to understand what happened. It was a mess. I'm just thoroughly embarrassed, especially considering that literally District 3 is the primary place where voters did not show up. Here, our home. Had we shown up, Glenn Youngkin probably wouldn't be governor. But I can't blame anyone for not being excited for voting for Terry McAuliffe. I can't blame you for that. But moving on, back to education. Currently, excuse me, the assaults on education. We have two primary assaults on public education. The first is political. The second is institutional. In regard to our political problems, we're looking at school choice, the voucher system, where Republicans want to give parents, instead of paying public schools the taxpayer funds, they want to give that check directly to parents and have them use it at private institutions. The issue with this is that it's taking funds out of public schools and putting them in private schools. Couple that with parents that can actually pay to go to private schools, and private schools are going to do better than public schools. Inherently, we live in a capitalist system. If they're getting more money, they're going to do better. That's one assault. The second assault is critical race theory. Remember how I said you cannot understand education without looking at desegregation, without looking at the development of two separate education systems in this country? That's an aspect of critical race theory. It's simply looking at the development of this country in terms of race. I'll get more into it in the next slide. You also have Don't Say Gay, and also, I'm not even going to get into Texas. Don't Say Gay in Florida, which is disguised under parental rights. And essentially what that's saying is you cannot discuss sexuality in any facet, or homosexuality primarily, in any facet in primary school, which seems okay until you think of all of the instances in which heterosexuality is literally forced down people's stomachs in school. Just think of any run-of-the-mill Disney movie, as you've probably seen all over social media. In addition to that, you have book banning. It's happening all over the country. Now, some of them are being banned or removed from curriculum for completely valid reasons. For instance, not reading Uncle Tom's Cabin to get an idea of what it was like to be a black person in the 1800s. I mean, yeah, that should probably be removed from the mandatory curriculum. Makes perfect sense. Or I also saw one about How to Kill a Mockingbird, because that was written by a white woman. It's not the best story to use to understand the black experience in this country. Makes perfect sense. But they're also banning books that are integral to actually understanding the black experience. Books that are written primarily by minorities, they're being banned. So I haven't gone through the lists because it's not going to do anything, but I digress. Next to those political problems we have in education, we have institutional problems, staffing crisis. Schools all over the country do not have the faculty and the staff to keep their schools running. I saw a Vice report about a principal, I forget, it was somewhere in the Northwest, like Wyoming, Montana, somewhere around there. The principal was driving a bus, being a principal, being a school nurse, just various jobs throughout the school she was performing. She was calling retired teachers. They wouldn't want to come back in. You probably saw the video of also that was in the same area of teachers fighting for cash in like a pit at some sports game or bull riding thing. Something like that. They were fighting over money to buy supplies for their classroom. This is an issue because teachers are not coming in at the same rate they're leaving, which means there is no one to teach the next generation. And if this continues to happen, our education system is going to collapse. We need teachers. We need to pay them more. We need to get them in the classroom and make sure they feel supported in the endeavors that they engage in. Also, we have decreasing enrollment. Again, that's kind of coupled with that school choice, but also with the abysmal, I mean, I know it's hard, but public education policy during the pandemic was terrible, and lots of parents just pulled their kids out and they found other options. With decreased enrollment, that means decreased funding, back on the slippery slope of the assaults on education. So, all of these taken in tandem, we really need to look at education and make sure that our education system is getting better and not worse. Now, on to critical race theory. So, before I get into it, should critical race theory be taught in schools? Elementary and middle school, probably not. Why? Because elementary and middle school students are not mature enough, they're not educated enough to understand what critical race theory is. They're just not. There's no need to try and do that. It's like trying to teach anatomy to a second grader. I mean, they'll get it, they'll understand it, but will they really comprehend it? Probably not. So, in regard to critical race theory, it originated as a post-civil rights intellectual response. So, with the civil rights era, many people believe we entered this post-racial society. And for Black intellectuals, they were looking at themselves and saying, well, we got this legislation passed, but many things have not changed. Why? And what critical race theory is a more broad and in-depth, both of them, it's broader and more precise, view of institutional racism. So what is happening throughout this country, throughout this country's history in regards to race that is causing things and phenomena to still exist, even though we're passing legislation that is meant to stop it? So that's where critical race theory came from. It is something utterly different from diversity, equity, and inclusion. And DEI has seen an immense growth in response to summer 2020, when everybody was protesting the murder of George Floyd. After that, a whole bunch of school systems, companies, everybody went to hire diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. And it was largely performative. Because where were these professionals prior to the summer of 2020? It was an industry. There were many people there. But going from, a few companies have DEI professionals to every company having a DEI professional, there are plenty of lateral hires. Plenty of people who are now engaging in this activity who weren't before. And it's no harm to them. They're trying their best, but we have to admit that they probably did some things wrong, which is okay. But we need to have an honest conversation about it. But what Republicans have done is taking this and turning it into an assault and making it an erasure of history, just a complete dog whistle and a complete disintegration of the actual intellectual thing and intellectual field that critical race theory is. So just for, I don't want to curse. Here's just a nice poll. I believe it was conducted by CNU. Sorry, should have cited it, but voters who oppose teaching the racism and its impact in American society, 63 to 33. 63% do not think we should ban it. 33% do. Opposing teaching critical race theory in school, 57% thinks we should not ban critical race theory, CRT. 35% think we do. Now, what you'll notice if you follow polling data is that across the country, you always see this 30 to 35% that is just with some real crazy stuff. That's Trump's base. And that is reflective across many polls, many places. Not going to go into it now, just food for thought. But what this also shows you is that this election was not fought on education nor CRT. Because if 63% of Virginia is saying we should teach racism in schools, why is it that Glenn Youngkin won? Why is it that Glenn Youngkin won? There has to be something else hiding under the surface. And it's simply the fact that Terry McAuliffe was not an exciting candidate. No one cared about Terry. And I don't say that it's offensive to Terry, but people didn't show up. The numbers are the numbers. Numbers don't lie. So before we begin, I think it's imperative that I mention Bobby Scott in this. He's the chair of education and labor. He is the top Democrat in the country on education. Not once did he hold a hearing on CRT during the election in 2021. That is a complete dereliction of duty in a time like this. We need our politicians exercising every single political muscle that they have right now, because now Washington, D.C. is surrounded by Republican governors. Now, that's just a whole other conversation I don't want to get into. But in a moment like this, in a moment that's so dire, when we could literally lose our democracy, and our representative could have brought every intellectual at the forefront of CRT, brought every teacher out of Northern Virginia who's claiming that CRT is being taught. Well, I shouldn't say teachers, because they weren't claiming CRT was being taught in schools. Bringing all of the people claiming that CRT was being taught in schools. Bringing the teachers from across Virginia and asking them, are you teaching CRT? We could have had headline news about these hearings. But no, none of that. We didn't get any of it. And these are how levers of power work in tandem, how you have to exercise all of the political strength that you have at every time to get the results that you want, and he didn't. He just simply did not. Nor did he have any hearings on the cess of the American Rescue Plan, asking teachers, how much did this help you? What did it help for? And I get it. When you do the actual work, like he did, that's the next slide. When you do the actual work, you don't spend your time gloating over it. I get that completely. But this is not the time for that. This is not the time to take the high road. We need to make sure people know what the Democrats are doing. So now that I kind of rung into him, let me just be clear. Bobby Scott was responsible for a $122 billion investment in public schools, the largest in history. Ventilation, PPE, additional hiring of factory, new resources for social, emotional, and mental health. Setting better academic standards. He was also behind the Every Student Succeeds Act, summer and after school programs to get kids back on track. He did it. He did it. Can't lie about that, and I'm not. But again, there are many things that he did not do, and when it comes to power, we lost some because of what he did not do. But we do thank him for his landmark legislation. So now I want to get into a future worth fighting for. What I would do, my opinions. Well, I already gave you my opinion, doesn't matter. What I would do, my policy preferences. So first, I want to go through a quick look of our district profile. So Old Dominion University released a survey called Life in Hampton Roads. And in that survey, we saw that about 26% of people here have children in schools. And of those 26%, 18% have disabilities. So we're looking at like 7 to 10% of people have children with disabilities here. And in spring of 2021, and these numbers do not add up to 100%, I know that, but this is the numbers that they gave. About 10% were homeschooled, 9% were in private schools, 88% were in public schools. So you're seeing that in Virginia's 3rd District, in the Hampton Roads, public schools are a pillar of our community. And those assaults on education I was talking about are happening right here as well. Of the participants in that survey, 60% said their education during the pandemic got worse. Parents said that of their children. We saw problems like their social life deteriorating, nihilism, they're not caring anymore. It's hard to make a child care through a computer screen. I mean, it's already hard to make them care in the classroom. Not really going to happen if they're sitting at home on their couch watching school through an iPad. And also increased stress. We were stressed too. We can only imagine what it was like for kids to shoulder that burden. But high school graduation rates have gone up. Year over year, they're getting better. Children here are getting scholarships. So our education prior to the pandemic was doing great, but the pandemic threw a huge monkey wrench in there. We need to make sure that we continue to make improvements on the progress that has already been made. So for me, I kind of got into this in the last Zebinar on the pandemic, but I think public schools missed a huge mark by not transitioning to a pandemic policy and adopting something along the lines of year-round schooling. We know how the coronavirus works. It works in surges. The surges last about 1 to 2 months. What we should have done is when it's a surge, close schools, send everybody home, give up on virtual learning. When the surge is over, open schools back up. Every day, try to educate them as much as you can until the next surge comes. That's something that we could have done once the vaccines rolled out, beginning of 2021. But we didn't For the most part, children have still been in school, but now we see this masking problem. Just excuse me. Um, Now we see this masking problem and so many other issues with it. Again, if I was at the forefront, these are things that I would have suggested in the time. Also, indoor plants. I know that probably seems very weird, but there are studies being conducted now on how well plants help with pathogens because they're out in the air. They change humidity. We know coronavirus does not transmit as well in high humidity, transmits better in dry, colder air. We also could have gone through partnerships with creators like Khan Academy. We had teachers who have spent their whole life in a classroom, some of them above the age of 50, trying to engage in virtual learning. When the Department of Education could have called up Khan Academy, sent them some money and said, hey, come up with some stuff for various age groups that is interactive, that's fun, that's engaging, so that kids still could have learned, but in a different way. And to not put that stress on teachers, to have them trying to figure out how to develop a lesson plan through an iPad. They're teachers. The responsibility is to develop the next generation, but they're not tech gurus, and they should not be made out to be tech gurus. Also, outdoor access. So much, like I said in the previous Zebinar, of our lives are spent inside. We really don't have any connection with nature, and that says a lot. This says a lot about the problems that are going on with kids being interested in class, with their attention span, with their happiness and mental health. Remember the problems that the ODU study showed us: social life, nihilism, increased stress. Outdoor access and indoor plants are scientifically proven to help out with those very things, with the very problems at the heart of our children's education. In addition to that, I'm sorry if you hear my dog. She's out the window and she just started barking. Gia. Shh. This is literally the last slide. The last slide. Gia. Shh. Okay. Lastly, we need to improve federal standards. Okay. I know the 10th Amendment makes it so that federal government is not in charge of education, but we can throw money in plenty of places. We need to increase the yearly funding for schools. We need to increase teacher pay. The U.S. tax code is a powerful force. We could simply give every public school teacher a $3,000 tax credit or not a deduction, credit. Anyway, give them $3,000 on their taxes. Just do it. It's not that hard. Also, improve upon facilities. That $122 billion was a phenomenal first investment. That cannot be the end. We also need to improve school lunches. It's not that hard to give children nutritious food. I remember going through school. Was the food edible? Yes. Was it something that I really wanted to eat? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The food was abysmal. For many people, I'm sorry, you saw me spit. For many people, schools are where they get their meals. We need to make sure that the meals they're getting are nutritious, are delicious. Both of those. And we can do both of those because the price of our children and their development, you cannot put a price tag on it. You can't stop and say, well, we only want to spend $3 per child. No, we can afford to spend $5, $6, $7 per child per meal. We can do it if we chose to. Also, we need to decrease the minimum student to teacher ratio. This again comes with more funding. We know that when classrooms are smaller, children do better. So what are we waiting for? Why are we waiting to fund these measures in the way that they need to do? We also need to have community integration so that students are not only learning about textbook issues, but they're actually involved in their community. They're actually engaged with their community. Their community is coming in to teach them things, and the students are teaching their community things. We also need more dynamic learning. I remember myself, the most exciting days were field trips, the experiment days, when we did projects. Those are the things that made me excited to learn. I'm pretty sure it's like that for every single person. But going into school every day and having to hit a testing standard, making sure that students can regurgitate all of this information, is doing a disservice to this entire educational institution. We can do better. We must do better. Because on a final note, what is our public education meant to be? Because at its core, public education was created to make workers. That was it. Science, history, math, English. Make sure you can speak correctly. Make sure you can do some math and science, STEM, so you can develop technology and pretty much combat the Soviet Union. Let's be honest. And history, so you know where you came from. Also revisionist history, because we can remember all of the things we were taught in school that completely was not true and everything that was left out. But education has grown so much more than what it was when it was first created. Education is now a daycare, because if you took away public education, millions of people would not be able to go to work every day. We can't ignore that fact and that reality of policy. We can't. You can choose to say that public education is not meant to be childcare all you want to, but if you take it away, our entire country would collapse. We saw what happened during the pandemic and how much parents got stressed out, how much parents just said, I don't have time for this. We also need to look at the fact that public education creates our citizens. It engages them in community. It is where they learn the skills to succeed at life. And we need to start doing that. In an effort to make our country technologically advanced and compete on the world stage, we've gotten rid of things like woodshop, learning how to repair your car, learning how to cook yourself a decent meal, learning how to do laundry. Thankfully, growing up, I knew how to do all those things. I was excited. I was always excited to learn. So I took it. I don't want to say that. So I basically, let's just say I remember being excited to iron my clothes when I was in the second grade. Things like that. I was excited to learn how to make house. Everyone's not like that. And everyone's parents don't have the time to teach them that stuff. Where do they learn it? In school. So we need to be honest about the role that public education as an institution plays in our society. Failure to acknowledge the role of public education will only lead to its destruction. And we cannot do that. There are children everywhere that depend on this institution for a shot at life, and we cannot afford to take it away from them when so many generations before us had it. So with that, this is our second Zebinar on public education. Thank you for showing up. Follow this campaign if you can. Send us money if you can. And I just hope you enjoy the rest of your day.